Hello, and welcome to data entry in the Soluno software. In this recorded session, we will take a look at the different ways to enter transactions into Soluno. So with that, let's get a copy of Soluno open. To add entries into the software, just go up to the main toolbar in the upper left, and we're going to use this icon here, the plus with the circle around it, for add entries. Click on add entries. And you'll see a series of tabs below to enter in transaction data. Please note that I'm logged in as an admin in the system, so I can see everything. There's a possibility based on security settings that you may not see all the same tabs I do. If you see a tab that you don't have access to in today's class, please contact your admin so they can adjust the security settings as needed. So the first tab we're going to look at is time and fees. Entering your time entries into Soluno. There's a few ways we can do this. For those of you that like to use a timer when you're working on something, there is a timer column here. Just click the little clock icon to start a timer running. And then just do your work. We'll circle back around to that while we let it put some time into the system. For those of you that don't want to use a timer and just enter your time straight in, then we can just do that as well. So the date, of course, is the date the work was performed. It's generally going to default to the date that you're entering it in the system. And that date is actually pulled from this upper right date, where it says July 19th. So if you want to backdate your time, because maybe you're always a day behind, instead of having to change this date each time to yesterday's date, you can change this date to yesterday's date. And then going forward, any new time entries I entered in will be date based off this date here. So for those of you who do like to backdate time, you might not necessarily enter it in the day the work was performed. You can use this shortcut to make sure your time entries are using the date you want on them. Otherwise, this date will generally default to today's date automatically. So enter in the date you performed the work. Enter the file you performed the work for, and you can look it up by file name, file number, contact name, or contact number. As soon as you see the file you want to bill, just click on it to load it in. The fee earner may load by default, and it depends on some of your settings. It may load the assigned fee earner, so whoever's defaulted as the assigned fee earner on the file, it'll open up with their initials. Or you can have it set that it actually opens and enter your initials every time. That's a preference you can set. So if you look up here next to the date, I have a picture of myself. You may just have a generic icon of a person there if you haven't loaded a picture. But this is your user profile. Click the user profile. And under user profile, if you go to preferences, there's a section here if you want to default to the assigned fee earner on the timesheet. So by having this turned on, whoever the default assigned fee earner is, that's what populates when I click on the file and it jumps over to the timekeeper. If you prefer to just be whatever timekeeper you enter in, then you can turn this feature off, especially if you're always entering time for yourself and you're not the assigned fee earner on the file. That way it can default to your initials when you enter them in the first time. That is controlled by you as the user, and you can turn that on or off in your personal preferences. And just remember to save any changes that you make. All right. Again, depending on who you have access to, I'm an admin, so I can access any timekeeper, but the timekeepers you're allowed to enter time for, you will see in this list. Generally, the default task code for time entries is billable work. This can be set at the file level to something different, but most of the time it'll be BW. But if you're entering something like non-billable work, you can choose the non-billable work. If you're doing electronic billing, you can choose one of the electronic billing codes. But a task code is required on all time entries, so you must have something, and that's generally why we're going to default to billable work. Depending on your settings, you may show both working and billable hours. Working hours is, of course, how long you spent working on the time entry, and generally that'll translate over to your billable hours as well. And your billable hours will be multiplied by the rate to give the amount of the time entry. The rate should populate automatically once you have a file and a timekeeper filled in. Based on those settings, we should be able to pull in the appropriate rate. The activity code, generally required on electronic billing entries, but can also be used as a shortcut for the explanation. So if I spent 3 hours in court, I could type in ATC for attendance at court, and then that'll populate as my explanation. If you prefer not to have the activity codes but still want that shortcut ability, you can just use the activity code in the explanation. So I can type in ATC, click on spacebar, and that'll expand out to attendance at court as well. Your admins can create those keyboard shortcuts as activity codes whenever necessary. For those of you that don't like it to pop up when you type in a little shortcut, you can turn that off. Again, that's a personal preference. So click on the user profile here. And here you can tell it to auto expand activity codes. You can turn that feature off, or include activity code and entry description. You could turn that off if you want to use the activity code in the activity section, but not have it populate the explanation of the time entry. This one will turn off the ability that if you type in, like I did, ATC in the explanation, it won't populate with attendance at court. So you can control those options here as well. I'm going to enter in another file. As you can see, since I'm using a signed fee earner, when I pull up this file, the assigned fee earner is Allison. So Allison's initials will populate, but again, I could change that if I wanted to. Let's say Allison's fairly new. She spent 2 hours doing legal research, but she feels maybe she only should bill the client an hour. So you can, instead of having the working be the billable, change that billable to 1 hour. And then we'll see the amount change, because again, working populates billable, and it's billable times rate to get the amount. So when I reduce my billable amount down, it reduces the amount as well. Now this is the time fees tab. So there may be times you want to enter flat fees. To enter a flat fee, select the file. Put in the fee earner, the task code, leave the working hours at 0, leave the billable hours at 0, leave the default rate, and for a flat fee, just type in the amount of the flat fee. So flat fees can also be entered directly through the timesheet. Working and billable at 0, rate at the default, just fill in the flat fee amount. Going back to my timer, I'm at the 7-minute mark. My time rounds to the nearest 1/10 of an hour. So as you can see over here, it automatically, when it hits 6 minutes, rounded up to 0.2. So the timer does respect your rounding rules that your admin has set up. When you're done with the timer, just click the timer again to stop it, and then fill in any necessary information. We'll just call this a telephone call with client. Right now, these time entries, I would think of them as draft entries. They are not saved to the file yet. I can go in and make any edits as necessary to these entries. In order to make sure they're available for billing, at the bottom left, you do have to remember to save your time entries. The entries that have a check mark next to them are the ones that will be saved to the file. Until they are saved to the file, they are not available for billing yet. So I'll just leave these unchecked at the bottom, leave those two checked. I click save. It saves those two entries to the file itself. They will now be available for billing. So for those of you who like to enter time throughout the day and then want to review it before you save it to the file, you can do so. And then at the end of the day, save all your time entries to the file for billing. Now, we're trying to make this as easy for you as a timekeeper as possible. So there's a couple other things you can do here. If you don't like the columns in the order that they're in, you can reorder the columns by dragging and dropping them. Put the columns in the order that's most conducive to you as the timekeeper. And we'll remember that. So next time you come into the software, we'll have those columns in the order you left them in. There might be columns you don't want to see. Maybe you never use the timer column, so that's just taking up space. Well, in the upper right, you've got the little hamburger icon, little 3 bars. If you click that icon, you can turn on and off columns. So maybe I don't want the timer column, so I turn it off. There's a couple other columns you can turn on. Maybe you want to put an entry on hold. Turn on the hold column. Or maybe you want to add notes about why you entered certain time entries the way you did. So you can turn on the internal notes column. Now, if I want to put this on hold so it doesn't get billed in the next billing cycle, I can just tick that box to put it on hold. And then, for example, if I want to put in the reason why I worked 2 hours but only billed 1 hour, I could add my note here about why I reduced the billable hours. Clients are not going to see the internal notes on their invoices. So feel free to turn on and off any columns that you need as a timekeeper to make your life easier for entering your time in. A couple other ways you can enter time. If you're in another part of the product and you remembered, oh, I want to quickly enter a time entry, and at the top in the toolbar, there is a quick entry icon, little lightning bolt with the plus sign. This will allow you to quickly enter a time entry regardless of where you are in the system. Click on the icon and just enter your time entry. Again, the date the work was performed. So maybe I remembered something from yesterday, so I can backdate that to yesterday. Enter the file I'm billing against. Again, I need my fee earner, a task code. If I want to use the activity code, I can, or I can just put in the activity code here or just type in whatever explanation I want. And then how long I spent on that particular time entry. Down below, if I click Save, it'll add it directly to the file and make it available for billing. If I just want to put enough information in and review it before I finalize it, then I can click Add to Sheet, which will put it here on the Time Fees tab. If I click Add to Sheet, it moves it over here. Now I can review it one last time before I save it to the file. And again, for those of you who use timers and you're another part of the product, maybe a client calls and you want to track the call while you're talking to them, we do have a timer icon here as well. Start the timer. If maybe you get interrupted, you want to pause the timer real quick while you're off the phone talking to a fellow employee, you can click on the timer icon and you can tell it to pause. Finish your conversation, get back to your client on the phone, click on the timer again, and resume. If you decide not to bill it at all, you can click on the timer and click Reset, and it'll just set it back to 0 and not time. But if you are going to bill it, once you're done with the timer, click on it, click Save. It will open up the time entry form. Just fill in the information as you normally would. You can click on Save and save it directly to the file. You can click Add to Sheet to add it to this timesheet. Or if a callback or something and you need to resume timing, click on the resume button to start the timer again, and it'll pick up right where the timer left off. In this case, I'll just click save to save it back to the file. Bypasses the sheet that is saved directly to the file itself. You can also import time. So down in the bottom right, you'll see the drop import file here. Before I do that, I'm going to save these time entries. Start out with a fresh sheet. So we do have the ability to import time for those of you who prefer to enter time into a spreadsheet and then just drag and drop it in. So I'm going to take one of my time templates here, drag it over, drop it into the import file, and it imports all my time entries. So another way to get time into the system. This is how I populate it for my training classes. If you don't need a specific time entry, of course, the trash can will let you delete individual entries. If you accidentally import time twice, like I had 90 some odd entries, actually I've got 92 left. Instead of clicking each one of these individually, I can just click reset. Reset deletes everything that's on the current timesheet. So be very careful of that. Before I reset it, if you do have a lot of time entries and you need someone else to review those entries before you save them, again, if you click the hamburger icon in the upper right, there's the option to export this out as a CSV file. So I can export all these files, all these time entries into a spreadsheet, open up that spreadsheet, and I can have someone else review the time entries before I actually post them. In this case, these are all duplicate entries, so I don't actually want to save them. I do want to delete them all. So I'm going to click the reset button. It will warn you we're about to remove everything. Are you sure? In this case, I am. So I click yes, and it deletes all my time entries. And again, it's only deleting the entries that were on the timesheet. The ones that I'd already saved previously are still saved to their respective files. So those are all the different ways you can enter time into the timesheet. All right, next up, expenses. This is where you can enter your soft cost expenses. Soft costs are those expenses that don't require you to cut a check and pay for out of pocket. So this is basically the same concept that we had with the time entry. So again, the date the expense was incurred, the file you want to bill this expense against, now, activity code, generally not required. I recommend you use activity codes on expense items whenever you can. I'll show you why I feel they're actually very useful here. Let's say I'm making photocopies. So instead of using the activity code, I just go to the explanation field, type in I'm making photocopies. And then I have to put in how many photocopies I made, how much I charge per photocopy, and then I have to select the correct general ledger account for those photocopies. I've actually got two. I've got an expense and I've got a recovery account. Now I know in my database I should use the recovery account, so I select that GL account. Well, sometimes not everybody knows what GL account to use, so you want to make this as easy as possible for your people to enter your expenses in. So I'll do this one with an activity code. So I put in the activity code of PH for photocopies. By doing that, it populates the explanation, the rate, and the GL account for me. All I need to do is basically now enter in the quantity, and it does everything else. And now I can just move on to my next expense. So I know activity codes generally probably not used too often unless you're doing electronic billing, but I find that if you set up your activity codes with the correct rate and GL account tied to it, it can help enter expenses more quickly and less mistakes with maybe a wrong GL account selected. And just like the time fees tab, you can drag and drop columns. There are a lot more additional columns you can turn on. So for example, in Ontario, you might have to charge a levy. So you can turn on the levy column to charge your transaction levies. Or in British Columbia, you have your trust administration fee. So we can turn on the tab for the TAF. In the States, some states can mark up their expenses. So they might turn on the markup percentage column or the markup amount column. So they can mark up the expenses. So pick and choose which columns you want to display. The tax status column in the US, we probably don't need it, so we don't have to display it. But in Canada, maybe you want to make it tax exempt for a specific item. So with that column on, instead of charging the GST, HST on these photocopies, maybe they're exempt for this file. So I can choose to make them exempt from tax. So take a look at the columns that are available. Add whatever columns you feel you will need to enter as a expense person who's entering these items in. And again, same process. Until you save them, these are just drafts. So remember to save them to the files. And again, we can import expense items. I can drag and drop my expense file in, and I can import expenses as well. I've already put those in, so I'm just going to go ahead and reset this sheet and delete them all from. So that is the expense tab. This is where you can enter your soft costs in. All right, now let's take a look at how to receive money into the operating account. That will be, of course, the operating in tab. It's going to default to payment. We're going to assume the majority of the time you're in this tab, you're receiving payments from your clients. So it should have a default bank account that populates here, but if you're depositing it into a different account, make sure you select the appropriate operating account, the date you received the money, the amount of money you received. Again, we're going to leave this as a client payment for the moment. How you receive the money. Now, these two fields, originating bank and originating check number, are turned off by default. I turned them on for today's class so that you could see that they are available. So if your firm wants to track when you receive a check, the originating bank and the originating check number, you can. Your admin just has to turn those two fields on in the back end under the admin settings. So if you don't see those two fields, that's normal for our default implementation. But if you want them available, then your admins can turn those fields on for you. We will then populate a receipt number. And now we just have to tell it who we received the payment from. Probably the easiest way to do it is look up the contact who sent you the payment, select them, and then when you either tab out or hit the ellipses button, the little three dots here, we will show you their outstanding AR bills. So here's all my outstanding invoices. I can either click auto allocate, which will pay the oldest invoice first and continue to do so until I use up all the money that I received. I can manually select the invoice I want to pay. Or if I want to just put certain dollar amounts on certain invoices, I can do that as well. So multiple ways to determine which invoice you want to pay. I'm going to auto allocate the funds to the oldest invoice and then click OK. If you want, you can put a memo here. Payment received for invoice 1731. Whatever you type in the memo field will auto-populate the explanation field. If the client needs a receipt, down at the bottom, you can check the print receipt button and we will generate a receipt that you can either mail or give to the client. Now all that needs to be done is to click Save to receive the payment. Saves the payment in, and in this case, it will also generate a receipt for me as well in PDF format. Here's the receipt. The other options you may use for operating in, if you're in Canada and you received a GST HST refund, select that option as the source to put in the refund. That way the refund will show up properly on your GST HST report. If you're in the US, let me quickly switch to a US set of books. Of course, you won't have the GST HST refund. Instead, you don't have to worry about that. Because we do operating in the US, we don't have to do refunds like that, so there is no source column. Switch back to the Canadian set of books. The other option you have is Other. So if this is not client related, you can select the Other column and put in, like if you're renting out office space, and enter when you receive rent in, you can receive it as Other. Tell us which GL account to put it against, and you can receive a payment in that way. Now, a feature that we added recently, let me go back in and let me do it as a payment, is the ability that if they overpay you, to put it into an operating retainer. So let's say I receive $10,000 in from a client. We'll receive this from Carolyn. Now let's say she put that money in. It was for this invoice 1639. I know she's got a lot of invoices, but we'll just say she really overpaid this one. And I click OK. So it applies that against that, and now she has this overage. Now, of course, I would normally apply this to other invoices, but for this example, we'll pretend that she doesn't have any more. So now I've got an overage here. So I want to put that as an operating retainer. To do that, you'll see the little hamburger icon, the 3 bars here. Click it and turn on the retainer column. We can now take this overage amount and add it as a retainer to her account, as a general operating retainer. To do so, put the file the money belongs to here. And then once you've done that, tick the box to apply this as a retainer. Now when I receive this money in, it'll pay off invoice 1639, and it'll put a $9,661 operating retainer on that file for the next time I bill. Definitely can be used in the US. I know in Canada, your rules might be a little bit different, and you might not be able to use this feature as much, if ever, depending on your province. But if you're a US client, that's how you can put money into an operating retainer when you receive an overage. But that is the operating in tab. Operating out, whenever you want to cut money out of the system and print a physical check. So again, make sure you select the appropriate bank account you're cutting the check from, the date of the check, and the total amount of the check. If you're a Canadian client and you have tax included, this is the total amount including tax. We'll cut out a check for, let's say, $2,500. For Canadian clients, it'll automatically tell you how much of that $2,500 is the tax. To actually print the check, make sure that this type is check. If you would like to put a reference here, you can. And you'll be able to select the check number when you go to print the check. Not yet, but when we print the check, you can select a check number when necessary. Usually the first time you print a check out of Soluno, you will need to set what check number you want to start with, and then you shouldn't have to change it going forward as long as you don't have any issues printing checks. Next, type in who you're paying this to. Let's just say this is for the hospital. In the memo, medical records. Now, if it is not client related, I would just have to select the GL account that I want this to go against. I think I have a medical records expense. I do. But if you're paying on behalf of a client, and of course you want to get reimbursed for the expense, then just put the file number here. So if I'm getting these for a specific file, I look up the file. We'll just use this one. It'll automatically go to your hard cost account when you input a file here. And depending on where you are in Canada, it'd be the 1210 because it's an asset. In the US, this would be the 5010 account. So it would be 5010.hard for the US set of books. Because the US uses cash accounting for the most part, this would be an expense account instead of an asset. So when you enter a file here, it'll automatically use the appropriate hard cost account. And then once I save and cut this check, it'll create an expense back to this file so I can recoup this $2,200 in expenses for medical records. Down below, the default is we're going to print the check. Now, for some of you, it may not be easy to print the check right now. You want to generate the check, but maybe there's only one printer in the office, so you have to change the paper to check stock. So you'll do it later in the day. So instead of printing the check now, you can click here and you can do it as a batch check. Put it in a batch to print later when you have access to the printer and can change out the paper to check stock. Other options you have is maybe you can't print checks, but you can request a check to be printed. So someone else at your firm actually prints the checks. So you'll see possibly two request features, again, depending on your admin settings. If you just choose request, when you save this, it'll put the check into a request queue, and then whoever's in charge of printing checks will have to check the queue and print the checks as necessary. If you choose request, print request, then when you save it, it will actually generate a PDF for you to print out of your request for the check. So you can put that request on whoever's desk is in charge of printing checks, saying, here's my request, I need you to print this check for me. So you can use the request if you're not allowed to actually generate the check. You can print the check now. You can print the check later in a batch. Or you can do a never print if you've already handwritten the check. So maybe you were at the courthouse, you had to pay a fee unexpectedly, so you write the check there. So now you have to come back into Soluno and enter that check into the system. So you come in and you choose never print, and then you enter the check number here. You'll see now the check number is underlined in red, requiring a check number. And you would type in the check number that you used when you were at the courthouse for that handwritten check. So even if you handwrite checks, maybe you never print checks out of the system, you still prefer to handwrite them, still enter them into Soluno. Just put everything in here, select never print, and then enter the check number that you hand wrote out so that we can still do a bank rec in the future. I'm going to go ahead and do a print check so we can see the process. So now, after you got everything set and you're ready to print the check, I click Save. Now it's going to ask for the check number. Again, the only time you really should have to change this is the very first time you're doing a check print, and we need to know which number to start with. And then click OK to generate the PDF of the check. Here's our check PDF to print. One thing you may notice is you don't see any margins on this PDF. And generally, your check stock has a margin. The margins are there, but they're hard-coded into the PDF, so you don't see them here, but they actually do exist. So not seeing it here is normal. This is where you want to be careful of. Now I want to print the check. So on the PDF, I click on the print icon. And it gives me a print preview. Now in the print preview, I still don't see the margins. That's where it becomes important, because now if you don't see the margins here, you're not going to see the margins on the check. So you want to make sure you see your margins in the printer preview. So if you don't see the margins, and all printers are different, so I can't tell you exactly where to go, but I can at least point you in the right direction. So for my printer, I have to go to More Settings, and then I have this scale option. I don't want to use the default. I tell it, fit the printable area. Once I select it, we will see the margins populate. So fit the printable area, and now I have my margins. Yours may have just a checkbox, fit the printable area, or fit, or something along those lines. But basically, find something where you can change the printer preview so you see the margins here. Once you see the margins here, then you know you're good to go to print the check. And then just click Print to actually print the check. And then your printer should remember the settings next time. You should not have to do this every time you print the check, only the first time. And then all print previews going forward for the printer, you should see the margins. So print your check. Once you're done printing, check the check out. Make sure it printed properly, because we're going to want to know, did the check print correctly? If it did, click yes, and you're done. You've printed a check out of Soluno. If for some reason it did not print, whether the printer jammed, whatever, then tell us, no, it didn't print correctly. And then it'll bring up a list of the checks we tried to print. In this case, I only tried to print the one, but there may be instances where you're printing multiple checks. If any of the checks you tried to print did print fine, find it in the list and check the box next to it. Down here in the bottom right, that tells Soluno that check printed, we're good to go. For checks that failed to print, uncheck the box or make sure the box is not checked. That'll tell Soluno, oh no, that check did not print. We need to try to print it again later after we clear whatever error occurred during the printing process. If you do have a check that fails, we'll tell you right up here, we're going to move that check to the batch check queue. So if the check doesn't print, make sure it's not checked, click OK, and we'll put that in the batch check. So where do those checks go that you either put in batch or you put in the request stage? They're going to go here to the bank admin tab. And again, you may not have access to bank admin based on security settings, so someone else may have to do this for you. But if you need to reprint the checks, you're going to go to the bank admin tab. And under bank admin, here's the release tab for checks that you requested. Requested checks go to this release tab. You just choose the account to see what checks have been requested. If you were trying to print checks and the check failed, those checks go here to the batch check print tab. So I go here, choose the appropriate bank account, and then here's the check I tried to print to the hospital. This is the one I told it failed to print. To print the check, clear the errors that you had with the printer, tag the checks you want to print. Matter of fact, I'll try to print a few. Up at the top, make sure this is the next check number you want to start with. Our default is the last check I tried to print was check 1402, but it failed. So we go under the assumption that your checks already have the check number pre-printed on it. So the check 1402 is no longer valid. So we number up to the next check, check 1403. But if you have the check numbers printed directly on the check from Soluno and you prefer to use that check number again, you can change the starting check number. But our default policy is we assume your checks already have the check number printed on it. Since that check failed to print, it's no longer a good check, so we number up to the next check number. And then choose Print Now to print your checks. It'll print the checks that you've tagged. I process it, and then we just go through that process again. It generates the PDF of my checks. There's now 3 of them. Again, I don't see the margins here because they're hard-coded in the PDF. But when I go to print the checks through my printer, I now see the margins because it remembered my settings from last time. So I should be good to go. And there's all 3 checks. And now I just click print and print my checks again. Once you've printed, you'll have that same question. Did the checks print correctly? So again, if something failed yet again, you can click no. If any checks did print correctly, tag them. If they didn't, leave them untagged. These 2 checks will be finalized. This check will go back to the batch yet again. But in this instance, we'll go ahead and say all the checks printed. So all 3 printed fine. I click OK. I go back to that operating account. Those 3 checks are no longer here because now they've been finalized because I told Soluno they printed fine. That is the process of printing checks in Soluno. Just verify that in the printer preview, you see the margins for the check. Change the settings as necessary. You will not see the margins in the actual PDF. They are hard-coded into the document. Next, trust in, trust out. Almost the same thing as operating in, operating out. Except, of course, now we're dealing with trust money. So we always are going to need a file here because we need to know which file the money is coming from or which file the money is going to. So if you're receiving a retainer in, it's a trust in. If you have multiple trust accounts, select the trust account the money is going to, the date of the check, the amount you're receiving. Again, I've got these fields turned on. You may or may not need them. We'll have a receipt number. You are welcome to change that if you prefer to have a different receipt number. And who you received the money from. If they're in your contact list, you can just look them up this way. And then in the memo, I'll just say this is a retainer. And now I need to put the file money is going to. Because until you have a file, that save button will be grayed out. Because the file is required, so no save button until you've got the file. We need to have that because of the trust. You can see he already has $5,225 in his trust account, so we're good. It's just going to add another $2,500 to that amount. Again, if I want to generate a receipt for the client, I can click on Print Receipt. And then just save to receive money into the trust account. And there's my receipt of payment. So receiving trust money in, pretty straightforward. Just you always have to have a file. You cannot receive trust money in without a file attached. There's got to be a file. And then trust out works the same way. As far as printing a trust out check, you have to make sure that you see the actual margins on the check. If it fails to print, put it in the batch. Otherwise, this is the exact same way as we just did operating out, except of course we always require a file. Now, if you do try to overdraft a trust account, I know that's a huge number, but I never remember. Actually, you know what? I can do 10,000. That should be more than enough to go out. There we go. Maybe I'm paying myself on something. So now I choose the file that I'm pulling the money from. Now he only has a balance of 7725 in there, so this would be an overdraft. So even if I continue on, click save, try to generate the check. There's the check number. I click OK. We will tell you it's going to cause a negative trust balance. And it requires an administrator override. So an admin would have to override this. Again, I'm an admin. I can do that. So we'll stop you. And the only way to go negative is you have to manually override it by saying, I acknowledge and understand, and click OK. So Soluno won't do it on its own. You have to acknowledge that you're going to overdraw that trust account. Now, we do know certain types of law that might happen. I think the best example is real estate, where money's coming in and out constantly. So you might be overdrawing it now, but you know you got money coming in 10 minutes. Though it's still not great practice, we do have to take that into account. Hence, there is ability to override and go negative, but an admin has to override it, and you have to say you know what you're doing. We will not purposely go negative on a trust account, but based on certain types of law, we do have the ability for admins to override and go negative if necessary. That's the trust in and trust out, similar to operating in, operating out, except these always require a file. The transfer tab allows you to move money back and forth between different bank accounts. Probably more used when you want to pay yourself after a billing cycle from a client's trust account. So maybe I've just run bills. The client's okayed me to do the trust transfer, and now I want to move the money and pay myself for the client's AR. So I put in how much I'm getting paid, which trust account the money's living in if you've got multiple trust accounts, which operating account the money's going to if you've got multiple operating accounts. How do you want to transfer the money? If you actually need to generate a check for yourself, you can tell us, please generate the check so we can deposit it. Otherwise, if you're just doing an all EFT, you can do an EFT as well. But we'll do it as a check for those that might need to see it. Tell us which file the money is coming from. And since they're going to pay a balance on an invoice, down below, we select the invoice the money's paying. So click on Select Invoices and choose which invoice that money's going against. And then click OK. Now I can generate the check so I can deposit that into my operating account, and then we will apply that $2,500 against that outstanding AR that we selected. So I just click Save. Again, follow the check process that I normally would. Generates the check. Did it print? We'll say it did. I've now transferred that money. I've paid that outstanding AR, and now I can deposit that check into my operating account. Otherwise, if you just need to move money from one operating account to another, you can do that as well. Again, if you actually need to move money to the petty cash, you actually have cash at the office, so you need to actually get the cash out. We could still print a check to do that. Otherwise, you can leave it as an EFT. You can move money from one trust to another. So if a client needs money moved from one trust to a different trust account, we can do that. So anytime you need to move money between bank accounts, use the transfer tab. That takes us then to our last two tabs, which are the payables for accounts payable. So you get an invoice from a vendor. We want to add that as a payable into Soluno. Go to the payable tab, pull up the vendor, choose the date of the payable. What is the due date of the payable? And how much is the payable? Again, if you're in Canada, the total amount including tax should be the amount. The reference number, this is the only time the reference field is required in Soluno. My recommendation is the reference number. Just put in the invoice number from the payable. That way, because the reference number needs to be or should be unique from each payable. So if you just use the invoice number from the payable, you should never have a duplicate invoice number for a vendor. So you should never have an issue with that being a duplicate. If you want to use alpha characters, you can. So I could type like this is invoice number, whatever. So that's fine. It's just, it should be unique for the payable for each vendor. So that's why I recommend just using the invoice number of the payable. If you want to put a memo here, what this payable was for, you're welcome to do so. Oops, apparently that is an actual. That'll again populate down the explanation. If you have a PDF copy of the invoice, you want to include it on the payable, you can do so here by either dragging and dropping the PDF or clicking in this box and pointing to the PDF. We will use, what do I have in my downloads? That one will be fine, I'm sure. And that way you can have a copy of the payable here. This is just an invoice I generated earlier, but it'll work for today's purposes. So you can have a copy of the payable directly on the payable in Soluno. Again, if any portion of the payable is paid on behalf of a file, put the file information here, and we'll bill that item back to the file. Maybe only a portion of this, maybe it's say $400 is file related, and the rest of it is firm related. So I could leave that there, and then I could change that explanation. So you can break it out amongst multiple files on a payable or what's firm related. And then you might have to pick a GL account. I have a GL account assigned to this vendor, so it populated automatically. If you don't have a GL account assigned to the vendor, then you'll have to manually select the GL account it should go against. And again, anytime you use a file, it'll automatically use the hard cost account for the file itself. If you have a vendor with multiple addresses, you can click this edit pencil to select a different address. Now, I only have one address on this particular vendor, but if you're using the additional address fields on the vendor itself, you'll be able to select additional addresses if you've got multiple addresses for the same vendor, so that the right address appears. So if I click on Edit Contact, if I go to Additional Addresses, I can add additional addresses here. Now I have a multiple address, save that change. And now if I click on the edit pencil, I can choose which address I want to use. Apparently, I mistyped that one. So you can have multiple addresses for a vendor. And then just save the payable. That is how you enter your payables into Soluno. To pay your payables, you go to Batch Pay Payables, which will list your outstanding payables. That way you can pay multiple payables at once. Just go through and tag the payables you want to pay. At the top of the screen, it'll show you the total of the payments you're about to make. If you got any discounts based on your vendor settings, what you've got in your bank, and what will be in the bank after you're done. You can do partial payments. So if you want to do a partial payment, maybe instead of paying the $2,800, I'm going to go ahead and just pay half of that. Whoops. If you double click, as you can see, it'll go directly to the payable, so you can edit a payable if necessary. Let's pretend I meant to do that. Otherwise, if you single click, you can type in how much you want to pay. So you can do partial payments here. If you need to print the check, make sure you selected check as the type, and we'll print actual checks to send to the vendor. And then just click Save to cut the checks. Here we'll give you a listing of the vendors who are receiving money, the total amount they're going to receive, and then if you're ready to print the checks, click Yes, and then follow the same exact check process we had earlier. Pull up the generated PDF, print the checks, etc. And once you pay those, they'll be removed from the Batch Pay Payables list. So for those firms that like to do check runs that pay a bunch of payables at once, the Batch Pay Payables will be very useful to pay a bunch of payables at one time. You may have a huge list of payables and you only want to pay one payable, and you don't want to try to track it down in this list. So another alternate way is using the operating out function. Do your operating out, choose, of course, the bank account and the date that you're paying the payable, and in the contact box, look up the vendor. And then once you looked up the vendor, when you tab out or hit the ellipsis button, it'll show their outstanding payables. And you just tag the payable you want to pay. And then click OK. Now here, because I'm paying early and I've got a discount set up, it automatically gives me my vendor discount. So now I just go ahead and save and print the check, and that pays the payable. Now, what I have seen is someone goes in, let me take a look at my payables right quick. AT&T, now let's just pay Aviva. So Aviva, I owe $1,500 on invoice 123452. So they go and they cut the check. They do an operating out. They say we're paying Aviva, and they're paying them $1,500. And then they come in here, pay invoice 123452, and then they put it against their accounts payable GL account. 2,000. And then they cut the check. I'm not going to do an actual check. I'll do this as an EFT for today. And they save. And it's okay, yay, we paid our payable. Well, yeah, you cut a check to Aviva and paid them $1,500, but we don't know that you paid a payable. If I go back to Batch Pay Payables, that's still there for $1,500 because we never attached the payable to the actual check that we cut. Now, if you catch it quick enough, you can fix that. So I can say, oh, okay, let me go to my reports and I can run my banking report to see the checks that I've cut. Use today's date. Look at the checks I cut for today. And there's Aviva. So I go in and I edit the check. So I drill down on it. Now, apparently I did net payroll as the, I probably got a Q, but we'll ignore that. All we care about is you see this column here. This is payable invoice number. There's no payable attached to it. So it didn't know what to pay, so it didn't count it. So what I do is I come up into the contact and I look up Aviva to get to my list of payables. And I link the payable by ticking the box. And I click OK. Now the payable populates here. Now I can save the updated transfer, EFT, that I did for the check. It updates this EFT in Soluno. The money's already been transferred. But now when I go to my payables, it shows that Aviva payable has been paid now. And it's been removed from the list. So don't make that mistake of operating out and cutting it directly to the vendor, because if there's no payable linked here, the payable is still unpaid in Soluno. So that is our data entry class for Soluno. If you ever have any questions, etc., feel free. You can contact us here at training@soluno.legal for any kind of training questions, or please visit our website at soluno.legal. Click on the resources tab, go to the training hub where we have recordings of this class as you just listened to. You can also sign up for our free webinars that we offer every month if you prefer to go to a live class. We also have mini videos that cover little mini topics, and we have our training documentation out on the website as well. I hope you found this video useful. If you ever need anything, don't hesitate to reach out to us. I hope you have a great rest of your day.